So welcome all to the first video FAQ lecture. I'm Jonathan Lim, and I'm the lecturer in charge for Econ 1101. So I actually do exist in person, but you just don't actually see me in physical form, but this is as good as it gets. So what these lectures are designed to do is they're basically designed to ensure that we can basically collate all of the questions that you have, and for those that students seem to have problems with, I'll be doing FAQ lectures to address them and to sort of flesh out some of these concepts to ensure that we're on the same page. So that's the first thing, and that's the purpose of these lectures. There'll be one every week to basically take your weekly questions and to answer them. So the second thing which I'd like to reiterate is that this is actually a very intensive course. You have to keep in mind that what we're doing is we're compressing 12 weeks worth of material into 6 weeks. So it's really, really important that you are consistent with your work. I mean, I've seen a lot of you guys already introducing yourself, which is great. And it's really good that we're creating a really nice, tight-knit community. However, what I haven't been seeing a lot of is you guys basically answering, for example, the review questions. And a lot of you are sort of still kind of taking a bit of your time with regards to play economics. So please be aware that by now, theoretically speaking, you should have completed the first 2 chapters. And it will basically snowball very, very quickly if you're not up to date. So unfortunately, this week the lecture will be relatively small or relatively smaller because there's only been 3 key concepts that we will be talking about, and that's the PPC, the CPC, and opportunity cost. They're the main 3, and we'll be sort of elaborating on these things as we go along the lecture today. So let's start with some definitions. So a lot of you guys seem to understand the idea of a PPC. So you guys kind of understand it as the idea that it represents all of the production possibilities for the economy. So if you go back to the book, we basically consider, for example, Alberto and Leo and say that, for example, he's got 16 hours a day. If they were to exhaust all of their time, each of them, and we were to graph them, we would have what we call the PPC. So that's basically a mapping of what the economy is capable of producing. So what a lot of you guys are starting to get a little bit confused about is this difference between the PPC and the CPC. So the CPC represents the consumption possibilities of an economy. So the consumption possibilities, as the name suggests, is what you can actually consume. So for example, you might be able to produce something, but given a particular set of prices, you might be able to consume more, at least more, or equal to what you are capable of producing. So there is a distinction between the two, and we will basically be going through a couple of examples to hopefully flesh out these concepts for you. And finally, we have this guy here called opportunity cost. So in many ways, the opportunity cost, I think, is quite a subtle concept. So by the books, it's basically the idea that if you were to undertake a particular action, you kind of had to sacrifice something to undertake it. So the example that's sort of given is that, well, what is the opportunity cost of, for example, staying in uni? Well, the opportunity cost is obviously the time and what you could have done with that time to actually come rather than go to uni. So that is what they call the value of the next best alternative. So that's sort of the differences between the 3 different concepts. So it's really quite important for you to understand these 3 concepts because it's the foundations for what we do in terms of trade. So that's basically some of the very, very core concepts. Then if you go and flick through the book, you'd then be seeing things such as comparative advantage, absolute advantage, and then the principle of increasing opportunity cost. So the idea of a comparative advantage builds upon the idea of opportunity cost. So if I have a comparative advantage of doing something, that suggests that I have a lower opportunity cost of doing that action compared to, let's say, someone else like Alberto. For example, the best example I can give here is that my videographer here, Sam, has a comparative advantage in making videos whilst I have a comparative advantage in lecturing, right? So he is definitely far better in making videos compared to me, but I am better than him in lecturing microeconomics than actually making videos. That's sort of the idea. An absolute advantage is basically saying I am better at doing everything else compared to everyone. So to really clarify this, I'm sure a lot of you guys have had that really smart kid in school which basically aced everything in all his subjects, right? And you're probably, and I probably am the guy who came third last in the state. So what I can say is that he is basically got an absolute advantage in every subject he does in HSC compared to me. That's sort of like the idea. The idea of comparative advantage is different. It looks at, well, relatively speaking, let's compare math and English, right? How much time do I need to spend doing math compared to English to gain, for example, an extra mark? And let's compare that to, for example, Sam, where he would then have to do the same analysis. That is, compare the amount of time he needs to do in math, he needs to sacrifice in terms of English to gain that extra mark. So one is a sort of comparative, a comparison of the two, whereas the other is literally what the word says. It's an absolute, right? So it is a very important distinction and one that will be reflected in the PPC as we'll see a little bit later. Then there's this guy here. So there's this guy here which basically which is the principle of increasing opportunity cost. And you guys probably have seen this in a book which is called the low-hanging fruit principle. So the idea here, where the idea comes from, is that when you have a tree, what you really want to do is you always grab the fruit which is lowest from the tree. And that's what they call the low-hanging fruit principle, and it's also called the principle of increasing opportunity cost. The idea is very simple. So what we say is that what you want to do when you're producing something is you want to employ the resource with the lower opportunity cost first and then move to those which have higher opportunity cost. So this is why, as we'll see a little bit later, we would have a concave shape PPC. So that's basically some of the key concepts. And let's now move on to the first of the three concepts which you guys have hopefully now understood. So the first is really about the production possibility frontier. Okay, so if you guys sort of remember, we have the PPC. It basically maps out what the economy can produce. And what we also know is that the PPC is also a mapping of the absolute advantage and the comparative advantage as well. It summarizes all of that. So the first thing to note is that the slope of the PPC gives you the opportunity cost of producing a good. So if I were to sort of draw this very simply, okay, so if we have Alberto, let's say, Alberto's PPC, and he is able to produce rabbits and bananas. So suppose that he is able to produce, if he spends 16 hours on a day, right? And the rate is basically he can produce 1 kg banana and basically 1/2 kg rabbit. per hour, then what would we actually have? What would the PPC look like? So if Alberto was actually going to produce all but spend all his time producing bananas, we know that he can produce 16 units. Okay. Alternatively, he could actually dump all his resources and all of his time into producing rabbits, in which case he would be able to produce 8 units of rabbits. So if we then join the line together, assuming that the trade-off is constant, then this line here is Alberto's PPC. Okay, so that's basically what the PPC is. But if you think about it, what does the slope actually represent, right? What is the slope? The slope is always, if you recall from high school math, rise upon run, right? So what is the rise? Well, if we take this simple example, it would then be 8, and then the run is 16. So we have 1 on 2. Okay. So you're saying, fine, great. What does that actually mean though? Let's give this a little bit more of an economics flavor.